So before we get started, I'm going to add a little bit of a disclaimer that I have wrote down 3 different setups I am considering recreating. How many of them I go for, I don't know yet. This is due to the fact that the way we're simulating here is very, very sensitive to the parameters we apply, and I have actually found that if you replicate the same parameters in the simulation forces across each scene, no matter if you have the same amount of segments on your geometry and you're using the same geometry and it's the same size, it still gets very, very different results. So there has to be a level of awareness here going into the fact that there is going to take R&D to get this result, and if you follow my parameters one-to-one, it is going to look different. And that was something I struggled with, especially preparing for the tutorial, because I wrote in the parameters to pump in and it wasn't doing the same thing that it was doing when I was making the scene. So first thing we're going to do is drop in a plane. I'm going to turn off my work plane. If we do NB here, pull up our segments, I found that a good amount is 30 and 15. Now there was a whole bunch of different methods I saw people doing. One of the most common ones, and this was one of the ones I was trying in X Particles last year, was cloning these disks and then using a gravity, throwing them up to a colliding sphere and having them wrap around the sphere. But the more I looked at the Windows 11 wallpapers, the more I saw it didn't look like there was any colliders there. And another thing I saw was people doing this with planes. And again, it's quite apparent that if you look at the wallpapers, this is my one, if you look at them, there is no sharp edges. So once I kind of looked at that, I started to think about how can we get this kind of shape, because this is what the wallpapers had, was this kind of curving shape, and they looked really nice. So we can't simulate on this disk like this with it coming to a point here. It's going to look stupid. So if we do Shift C and type in remesh, holding Alt and press Enter, we're going to remesh that, and we're just going to leave it like that, and then I'm going to press C. So we have this remesh disk, and this is good to start simulating with. Holding Alt again, let's grab a cloner and let's set it to linear. And I've generally been starting out these simulations on about 15. But what we're going to do, I'm going to set the Y on the distance between them to about 10. And I'm going to drag this down below the center of the world. And I found there's 2 forces here that are going to create a good look. But first, let's do Control D, go to Simulation, Scene, turn off our gravity. And then let's add a cloth tag to the cloner. And good thing about this, we don't really want to touch the cloth tag. Again, if you look at my references, this is cloth, but there's no wrinkles. So this is another reason we're using quite a low poly disk. And that comes to our benefit because we don't want tons of wrinkles. We want this kind of thick structure, but we just want it to be bending. So let's go to Simulate. And the first thing we're going to do is grab an attractor. Now, what I've got wrote down here was a power of 1,000. And I'm going to set this to 300 just so we can play through. When it comes to caching, we would maybe only cache about 90 frames, but I just want to play this through. In fact, no, we would cache all 300. I would just maybe only use 90 frames if I was animating it, but we're not animating it, so it's fine. So if you play this now, disks are going to get shot up to the attractor really, really quickly. You can already see there's something going on, but it's not nice. So what I'm going to do is we're going to add a rotation. And in the rotation, we're going to set this to 1,000 as well. We're going to set it to force. And in fact, I made a mistake. Let's set the attractor to 100. Now in the rotation, let's add a spherical field. Now I want this spherical field to be a little bit smaller than the disk, maybe about 70 centimeters. So now if we hit play, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be a step forward. So sometimes this can create the look that we want, and sometimes we're going to have to keep playing. And in this instance, it's quite clear we're going to have to keep playing with it. So the way I figured this out to get this look is we want to always keep the disks centered with the attractor. Otherwise, the rotation will try and throw them off into the distance. But if we can get an aggressive enough rotation without it folding them all up like a burrito, it's going to curl out after about 90, 100 frames, and it's going to look like this after enough rotating on itself. So this setup was a little bit different. I did use a field force, and we'll go into that a little bit later, which is why you can kind of see something going on in the middle. But for most of them, I was the base setup was always rotating them around. And I did have these early renders as well, where this was just strict rotation. I ended up not liking this so much. This, I think in essence, was maybe a little bit closer to the original, but I just didn't like the way it looked. So I remade it. So let's play with these parameters a little bit and try and find something that's going to work. I'm going to try slightly more aggressive rotation to begin with. So I'm going to try about 4,000 on the speed. And you can see now that it's trying to ping them around. It's trying to take them around the sphere, which is just the spherical field, which is just irritating. So I'm going to compensate by bringing up the strength of the attractor and setting that to force. Maybe 400. And that's better. And now we have this stray one, which is nice. So let's find a frame count early on. Now I still don't like the setup we have. I'm going to try and bring up the attractor even more. Let's try something really aggressive, like 1,000. Maybe a little bit lower. Okay, cool. Now this is the kind of look that we want. So if I come back to the beginning and I go to the cloner, holding Alt, I drop in a subdivision surface, bring that down to 1, and then holding Alt, I drop in a cloth surface. I set this to 0.5, and then holding Alt, I drop in another subdivision surface. I set these both to 1. I'm going to turn them all off. I'm going to play that again. Hoping it looks the same, and it does. Now if I turn these on, I'm going to turn off my world axis, drop in a camera, set this to 135 millimeters. You can see there's something like the Windows 11's wallpapers. So this is the basis of the setup, and going forward I'm going to show you another setup now and show you how we can get a slightly different result. But this is kind of how I've been going about it. And you're going to get different results each time, and as you play with these parameters, things are going to vary a lot. Other things that I found impact it drastically is the count here, but also the distance between them, as well as the size of the disk. All of these can shake up your results dramatically fast. I wish it wasn't so sensitive. I wish I could tell you what causes it to be so sensitive. I don't understand a whole lot about why this works, honestly, but I got it to work and I got it to recreate the look. So I think it's a good standpoint, and I'm sure people will expand on it after I create this tutorial. And you can even get some really, really nice angles here that's just going to recreate the look. And this is another thing I was doing, was making the whole thing editable by right-clicking on it and connecting the objects. And then I was able to rotate it and use it kind of as an object. But we will get into that a little bit later. For now, let's create another setup. Now I've got all the same stuff in another scene here, just in case I come back to that one to take through to Octane and start doing art direction on. Again, it's because it's unpredictable. I don't know what results we're going to get. This one might look horrible, but I'm going to show you the method anyway. So we're going to keep these kind of aggressive parameters we've got, because this is what's working right now. And for you, this might be 1,000 and 100, like I initially tried to do. It might be 8,000 and 2,000. It's going to vary. One thing that I found added a lot, and by the end of the kind of process of me creating a lot of these renders, I was putting this force into most of them, and that is the field force. So with the field force, I'm going to set the strength to 5,000. I'm going to go kind of crazy with it. This is just at first. We can work back from that if we need to. I'm going to add a spherical field. I'm going to make it really big, about 250 centimeters. Turn this off because those lines are really horrible. And then if we play through this, you get something. Again, if I turn on those three, and again come back to wrapping up this camera in really weird angles, which of course is not optimal for actually creating a scene, but like I mentioned, we would make it editable and then have a piece of geometry that we could rotate so we don't have to do this. But in terms of eyeballing what you might want to take forward, these camera angles can be handy. So you can see here. Now this was so aggressive that it's actually messed with the collisions. Now we could compensate and mess with our substeps, but I'm not really going to bother with that right now, because the issue is more in the field force. So let's bring this down to about 2000. And then the rotation is going to come into play. And I think the field force can sometimes work as a better attractor. So in a lot of instances, I was actually turning off the attractor, just going with the field force, and then letting it rotate. And that was giving me much better looks than, maybe not this, this looks a little bit strange. I mean, of course there's a place for it, but in some instances this was giving me better looks. I think at the moment, I like the attractor, and I would maybe do about 500 here on the field force, and have them both kind of playing into each other rather than aggressively going for one or the other. I think that's possibly the better way to go. But it seems to have gotten a habit of creating this weird kind of fold, this big long fold. So let's try something else. Let's bring up the count. Let's increase the size. Let's maybe increase the distance a little bit. Again, let's always make sure it's below that world axis. Otherwise, strange things start to happen. It's up to you if you want to find that out or not. Hit play, see what happens. Now the issue is when we have so many of them is the bottom ones seem to drag up. I mean, I call it an issue, but in some instances, again, it can be beneficial. But what's probably causing this the most is the field force not being big enough now to cover all of them. So if we increase the size of that, you can see they're all getting pulled up now. So now if we let this play out and let them begin to rotate, some cool stuff starts to occur. Let's try one more with a little bit more power on that field force now. And you will often find that the more aggressive numbers you put in, the more Windows 11-y it starts to go. So now if I turn on the subdivisions and the cloth surface, and we have a little look at this, again, it's very Windows 11-y, but there's still a lot of collisions here. So at this point, let's look at the substeps. Usually I found that if you just bring this down to 15, it'll fix a lot of your issues. But there's something here that kind of takes this over the edge and really seems to amplify how everything looks. So if we go to MoGraph Effector and grab a plane, holding Alt, go to Parameter, turn off the position, come to Scale, check both of these, and hit -1. And then we go to Fields. Let's add, I don't know, let's add a box field. And we go to Remapping, let's invert it. If we play with this and get a taper, almost, between the top and the bottom. So the ones at the top are smaller than the ones at the bottom. This is gonna, because they're smaller, they're gonna crumple up and wrinkle a lot more. So this creates a nice kind of centralized look and was really where most of my looks were coming from towards the end. So this attractor needs to be a little bit more intense now, just to hold them in place. And this is gonna take some playing with. Let's bring down that field force to 500. bring down the attractor again to 2000. And we're just looking for a nice middle ground here. And you'll usually find that when you subdivide this, something nice is happening. Although it doesn't look like it now, something nice is happening. As we get through this, you can pause this towards the end. And this was where most of my best results were coming from. So I'm not going to spend too much time going over this parameter pumping, changing. I'm sure you're aware as a Cinema 4D user, even if you're very novice, that this kind of stuff takes a lot of playing with, and I did try my best to bring you parameters to put into it and get you a result, but unfortunately this is not one to play ball like that. So keep playing with it if your result isn't like this. As you can see, mine isn't even like this yet. You can see it's on the same lines though. So I'm just going to sit for a little second and see if I can get something decent out of this. Okay, so I've messed with a couple of parameters and I've got something I really like now. So this is definitely something I would probably take to render. That's a nice kind of swirl here. And you have this kind of nice taper at the edges. So what I did, the attractor is set to 1000. I brought down the rotation drastically. I think it was trying to apply the rotation when I really wanted things to have this kind of a neat swirl just based on the collision. So at this point, the strong rotation isn't really needed for the setup with the field force. So I was just kind of bringing that down, and then I brought the field force up a little bit and it softened things up. So I think typically with this setup, you want things to flow up a little bit slower. And when it comes to animating, that's going to be nice. So between these two setups, so just to recap, this was our first setup, very basic, rotation and attractor. Pulling up all the discs and then getting them to flow around until they blossom. This was our first setup, very basic. There's some good things to be done here, especially with, again, more clones and doing the taper in size like we did here. And then we have our second setup, which is what I'm going to move forward with, where everything flies up here. And by the end, there's this nice kind of blossoming look. Now you'll often find that there's usually one good angle that these look good from, and the rest of the time they look a little bit strange. This should be good enough for us to get something from, but I think I'm just going to play with it a little bit more, and then we'll take this to Octane. So I found at the later frames this just gets even nicer, so I'll go forward with this. Now what we're going to do here to bring this forward is there's two ways. We can right click and connect objects and then put that back into the subdivision, cloth surface in the other subdivision, or we can bake this out as an alembic. If you're going to animate it, bake it out as an alembic. I think what I'll do is bake it out as an alembic here, just so we can slide through it if we want to change the frame. I think that in terms of art direction and not working destructively, I think that's a better way to go. So let's do that. So let's just select this. Let's go to File, Export. Make sure this cog is selected. Make sure Merge Generated is on. Let's export this alembic. And then let's do File, Merge Objects, merge this back in. And you're going to see in here, we have this cloner. So drag that out, delete everything else. And now, if we turn that off, we have our cloner here. Well, our cloth sim. So again, let's do the same thing. Let's drop this in a subdivision, drop this in a cloth surface, and then drop this in a subdivision. I'm just going to bring down the count again before Cinema gets really angry. So now this is definitely ready to go into Octane. So we'll do that going forward. We'll prepare our scene and start doing some renders of this. So I've packed this up and I've called it sim. And then we've got our new cloner here. So let's just rotate this to the center of the scene because we want this side. This is the side that looks good, so we'll rotate that 90 degrees. Drop in a camera. Let's make that camera 135, in fact, maybe more like 120. Coordinates, we'll zero out the X, zero out the Y, zero out the H and the P. And then we can orientate this however we like. Now you may have noticed on the Windows 11 renders, they kind of tapered in very well. And they tapered in. So I really like that we have this look here, and that was something that I wanted when I was creating the renders. So we turn all these on, and you can see there's quite a nice composition here. And a little camera trick, if I'm to duplicate this, is orientating this up and bringing it back down. Can just help shave off parts of it and make things look a little bit nicer. Now let's start up the Octane Live Viewer. I'm just going to save the scene now though, because I've not been saving it and that's really stupid. And now we're in Octane. I'll set this to path tracing. I'm going to lock the live viewer. I'm going to set this to 2560 by 1440, that's 2K. And now we can start work on this. So we don't have to use any textures, we can do this all within Octane. Don't have to use any HDRIs. It's all very centralized. So we'll drop in an Octane Sky, make it black. And we'll drop in a light. Right click it. We'll target that to the main object here. And I'm going to press F2, cameras, perspective, NA. I'm going to turn off my work plane, turn off my world axis. And now I've got this view so I can move around. You can see that's just replaced my top view. I can move around and not have to worry about it affecting the live viewer. So I'm going to drag this light off to the side and probably going to leave it like that for a couple minutes. Let's bring up the sampling rate. I'm going to go and add a Octane camera tag. I'm going to add highlight compression. And let's just go for this standard Windows 11 look, this blue look. So I'm going to call this shadow. I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to set it to visible environment. I'm going to call this BG for background. And we'll make this black, but not right now. Let's add in a Octane specular material. Let's apply it to the cloner. I'm still calling it a cloner, but at this point it's a cloth simulation really, isn't it? So I should probably rename that. Call it cloth. Let's go to our node editor. But before we go any farther, let's go to our render settings as well. I'm going to make this 248. 24888 and make the GI clamp 10, and then I'm gonna add here a random walk medium. Then I'm gonna take an RGB spectrum, I'm gonna plug that into the albedo, I'm gonna plug that into the transmission, and then let's add a whole bunch of roughness. We can bring down the density to about 25, and then let's make this blue. So you might also want to bring down the reflection a little bit as well, because you get these kind of white highlights and they don't look awesome. So let's maybe make sure the random walk medium's plugged into that. That'll really help. And you can see here the density is playing into it a little bit. Now I usually kept the density somewhere decent. I just wanted light to be passing through it ever so slightly. So now that's blue, let's play with the light. So maybe we could try the light on this side instead. I think what I'm going to do is bring up the power a little bit. That's W to switch between the world axis and object axis. In the distribution, I'm going to go to plugins, Octane, I'm going to add a fall off map. I'm going to set it to 90 degrees for now. Which is kind of similar to no fall off, but I might switch it. So what we're getting here that I'm not liking is just a lot of reflections. So let's bring this down. Maybe a tiny little bit. And I think I didn't mind that light here. But let's just duplicate it and have a light on each side. Maybe this one can be more directed to the front. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And now, let's try and make this background blue. Now it looks cool like this, but there was something in the Windows 11 renders which looked really, really nice. And that was a gradient. So, plugins, C4D Octane, gradient. Now let's make this radial. I'm going to come back to this center view here. And then let's go into the sine wave. Let's drop down our projection and our transform. If we mess with the scale long enough here, or come out the camera, if we can see where this radial gradient is, we can start to center it up. So sometimes setting this to box will help as well, as you can see here. And if we come back to our camera, we can narrow this in. So something like this. And we can maybe orientate this a few degrees till it's under the object. So it's sitting behind it and we have this gradient kind of spanning out. Now this on white actually does look nice. Again, if you look at my initial render, it looks nice on white. Let's maybe set this up at 5. Let's come back here. Let's set this to a kind of lightish blue, followed by a darker blue. So I'll take some tweaking to get right, but it shouldn't take too long. I might stick with this for now. I am going to enable ACES tone mapping in the camera, just so we can get a little bit of a better look about what to do with the colors here. So let's bring up our exposure a little bit, and I'm going to mess with the lights again, because the lights are holding the scene back quite drastically right now. I'm going to go for something a little bit more dramatic with some more shadows. Let's bring up the density here to about 50. And I'm going to straighten out this color. Go for a more aggressive blue. But the absorption is kind of pulling it down into a purple, which I don't like a whole bunch. But if we pull away the light, we should be able to counter that. I'm going to come back to sRGB for now. I just wanted to use that just to get a little bit of a better grip on where the colors are at. But for now, I'm pretty happy in sRGB. So what else to do here? I wouldn't render this out by any means. I would continue to work on this, and I think I'll probably stay for a couple more minutes and see what we can do. I'm not totally happy with it, but I think for most of you, it's going to be at a point where you're probably very thrilled with it. And it's a tutorial, so I'm not going to bully myself into making something too final. But I'll sit for a couple more minutes. So I've just dialed back there. You probably saw me as I was talking, dialed back in the timeline a little bit. Tried to get slightly different composition here, slightly different formulation. I don't like that at all. That looks really suckish. So let's come back to where we were, maybe something like this. That looks cool. That looks really cool. Okay. Control-Alt-S to save incrementally. I'm going to try one other thing I did in my original renders, is I did a massive camera, about 400, totally flattened it out. Now this can mess with the gradient on the back, but you may have noticed when I changed the position a second ago down to about 30 in the frames that parts of it seemed really far forward, and if you grab a big camera like this, it just completely flattens it out and makes it look really, really nice. I think all I'm going to do is increase the colors on this background to feel a little less pastely. I'm going to call it there. So now we need to bring down the size of the gradient again. So I've realigned that gradient based on our new camera, and I think I would be happy to leave this here. Not a whole lot else of change. Let's try a close-up camera angle. Definitely looks cool. And there you have it, Windows 11 background in Cinema 4D 2023 and Octane. I would imagine rendering in Redshift is dramatically similar, so don't hold yourself back from doing that if you use Redshift. There'll be a few things to tweak here regarding the amount of noise and the absorption, but I'm sure that for most of you, it's not an issue. If you do struggle, I would reference different tutorials regarding random walk nodes and subsurface scattering. It's not super complicated stuff by any means. And I'll even admit that in some of these renders I was turning off the specular almost entirely. But also some of this could be due to sRGB and the color kind of swallowing itself. Probably notice most of that goes away as we lean out of the color. So a couple different fixes there, but I don't think it's too much of an issue or cause for concern. Another thing, like I said, I was doing a lot was rotating this. So have a little look here at how this might want to do this without the cloth surface turned on. But if we just rotate this around, enable this, and this is kind of the process that I was doing. With different things like this, that doesn't look nice at all, but you get the point. So I'm going to leave this here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for bearing through this. I hope it wasn't too irritating to work through and to put in the parameters and get the simulation to a good point. Trust me, I know how annoying it is. I went to record this tutorial 2 or 3 times and got very irritated by it. So I really hope you're able to create some awesome renders with it. The sky's the limit with this, and I'm really chuffed that I managed to suss out a decent way of recreating this look. Quick little plug at the end of the tutorial, as I feel like I've earned it now. I just launched my Patreon, so I'll put an extended version of this tutorial on there because I need to incentivize you to buy it somehow. But there's, like I said, this tutorial is very messy and there's a lot that I want to do and show you, and I don't want to make this tutorial hours long, and there's a lot of complexities in it, and I would just like to be a little bit more relaxed during that process due to how maniacal it is creating these simulations. And that's kind of the tutorials you're going to see on my Patreon, is more relaxed. I'll have a face cam, more about my workflow, more about just working through things. So I'll probably put some project files up there as well if you're struggling. And on top of that, I am just made public my private coaching, my mentorship that I do. It's a 12-week mentorship learning Cinema 4D and Octane. So you'll see that in the link tree as well, and you can book a discovery call. So if you're interested in that, definitely reach out. But that's about it. I hope you create tons of awesome renders with this, and you can hopefully see that we're not too far off the mark from having renders like this. Definitely try this on the white background. Maybe I could just do one cheeky thing quickly. Turn that off. Try that white background, because I just can't resist it. It does look cool. It does look very cool. So there you go with the white background. Come back to the blue for now. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking through this tutorial. Thanks for all the support as always. And with that being said, I will see you in the next tutorial.